One of those larger-than-life figures in the Old Testament is King David. Man's the shepherd king anointed by Samuel to be king, and the stories with Saul. He's one of the ancestors of our Lord Jesus Christ. He is larger than life, and a huge chunk of 2 books of the Bible take place talking about his stories and what happened in his life. And he's one of those people that in the book of Acts, they talk about it, even in the book of Acts, that when Paul is giving one of his sermons, he talks about David repeatedly. And in Acts 13:22, Paul calls David a man after God's own heart. A man after God's own heart. So what I want to do is this week and next week, this is kind of the setup for next week as well. This week and next week is to look at David. To see 2 of the stories about King David and just see what kind of guy this guy is in King David. And this morning, as Jim mentioned in his children's sermon, it's David and Goliath. David and Goliath. It's from 1 Samuel chapter 17, and it covers most of 2 chapters in 1 Samuel. So we won't read the whole thing, but I'll kind of tell the story as we're going through. The story starts off is that the Philistines now mustered their army for battle. And you read down in the stories what happens. The Philistine musters their army for battle. And the Israelites muster their army, and they come out and they face one another across what's called the Valley of Elah, E-L-A-H. And the Philistines are on one side, and the Israelites are on the other side. Typical warfare in 1,000 years before Christ, they'd face off against each other. This is not a new battle. This is not something new that suddenly popped up in the last 30 days in the history of Israel. The Israelites had been fighting the Philistines for 1,000 years to this point. The argument and the disagreement and the conflict between the sons of Abraham and the sons of the Philistines go back actually to the time of Abraham. And you read down through, you hear Isaac doing battle and disagreeing with the Philistines. You hear of the time of Joshua coming in and having warfare with the Philistines. You have at the time of Judges, multiple judges having conflicts and wars with the Philistines, and that one that seemingly stands out, that judge Samson. Samson's long story in there is his battle with the Philistines. You go and progress on to the time of Saul. It's a battle with the Philistines. So this battle in Israel's life is not simply something new. It's an old battle. Like some of the old battles that we have in our lives. Many times what we have going on in our lives is the battles we face and the Goliaths we face in our life. And the battles that we have to fight are old. Max Lucado wrote a great book several years ago. It's called Facing Your Giants. And his lead story in here is about David and Goliath. And he has this quote in here. I'm just going to read one paragraph from it. Your Goliath doesn't carry sword or shield. He brandishes blades of unemployment, abandonment, sexual abuse, or depression. Your giant doesn't parade up and down the hills of Elah. He prances through your office, your bedroom, your classroom. He brings bills you can't pay, grades you can't make, people you can't please, whiskey you can't resist, pornography you can't refuse, a career you can't escape, a past you can't shake, a future you can't face. And you might go on and says Goliaths and the battles that we have to face these days can be aging parents that need our help. It might be kids that need more help than we want to give them. It might be your employees. It might be your employer. It might be too much job. It might be not enough job. And going on. All battles that we have in our lives, and in many cases it's an old battle. It's a battle we fought for years in our lives. It's not something that just jumped up. This particular battle that the Israelites were facing against Goliath and the Philistines, this one, as it starts our story right here, this one is 40 days old. They've been standing across the valley at each other, ready for combat for 40 days, waiting to do battle, hearing the taunts of Goliath. I'll talk about that in a second. But there's this battle, as I said, this battle that goes on inside us. This battle with self. Paul writes in Romans 7, he says, "But there is another power within me that is at war with my mind. This power makes me a slave to the sin that is still within me." In our lives, we face the Goliaths. In our lives, we face the wars that take place inside us. That too often, sometimes, that we're on the losing end of those wars. It's a battle that might be how I really am versus the way I want to act. It might be a battle about my self-image, that you might see yourself and have difficulty seeing yourself as God sees you. That God's declaration that you're a precious gift of God. You might sit there and see yourself and have that negative self-image. It's have that struggle, that battle that rages in with all of us, that battle that goes on. It says it's about me. We want it centered on ourselves. We get selfish in our lives. And Jesus says to go out and wash feet. Go out and serve your fellow man. You're filled with grace. Go out and serve your fellow man. And it's the battle we have to face each and every day that rages inside us. So a point for you to ponder this morning. You don't have to say it out loud. You don't even have to write it down. For you to think about. What's your Goliath? What's the Goliath in your life? What's that old battle that you have to face each and every day in your life? That if you try to face it alone, you're not going to make it. What's that battle in your life? So what happened in the story here, back to our David and Goliath, is the Israelites are facing off against the Philistines. And each morning what would happen, Goliath would walk out in front of the Philistines and he would taunt the Philistines. One man coming out and doing single combat. It was kind of a common practice, some historians will tell us. Saves all the bloodshed. One person would go out and the two best champions of the armies would fight to the death. And whoever won, that's who won the war. And they'd sit there. But everybody in Israel was afraid, it said. It says in here that Saul and his troops heard the Philistines' challenge. They were terrified and lost all hope. And in comes David. David is actually a shepherd boy. He's not even with the army when this conflict starts. His father sends him to his older brothers to take food to his older brothers and see how they're doing. And David hears this. And David gets a little upset about it. But not jumping ahead of my story here. But the Israelites sit there and the Israelites see Goliath, and the Goliath is standing there. And it says that Goliath is anywhere between 9.5 and 10 feet tall. I thank you, Mr. Jim, for doing your children's sermon. That red mark over there. Now, for those of you sitting over here wondering, where in the world is the red mark? Okay. I need you to look across the way over there. You see on the facing right there where the air conditioner vent is? The red mark is on the top of that air conditioner vent. Okay? Because they can't see where the mark is. All right. It's some 9.5 feet tall. I want to give you a frame of reference for that. The one NBA basketball player in the news right now, even despite the NBA finals going on, that's seemingly always in the news, is cover everything. You probably have heard of him, a guy by the name of LeBron James. All right? Goliath is 3 feet taller than LeBron James. Actually, 3 feet plus. 3 feet taller than LeBron James. That's a yardstick. That's about probably almost this height. Taller than LeBron James. And it talks about in here is the size of his armor. Not only is he 9.5 feet tall, I like to describe Goliath as the size of a small building. It's not a tall, skinny guy. He's the size of a small building. He's sitting off here facing. And what happens here is Israelites, all they're seeing in front of them is Goliath. All they sit there and see is Goliath in front of them. And they were afraid. When we sit here and we focus on the Goliaths in front of us, we can't help but get afraid. We sit here and focus on the Goliaths in front of us, you can't help but get afraid of things. Get afraid. We get focused on the Goliath in front of us and we start panicking and saying, what are we going to do? Might be in our lives. It might be in your church. It might be all kinds of different areas. We start focusing on what are we going to do? Or we sit here and we start worrying and stressing over the wrong things. It's the fear. It's looking at the Goliaths. You ever been in an organization? This one's not it. This church is great. But a church or an organization or any kind of organization, they're seemingly arguing over the little irrelevant things. A lot of you have. I see that on the grins. It could be fear. We start focusing on the wrong things, start focusing on the Goliaths in our life. It ends up in fear. We end up in fear. And fear leads us to the bottle. Fear leads to abuse. Fear leads us to workaholics, schedule-aholics, computer-aholics, and relationship-aholics. Fear leads us down a path we don't want to go. But the other thing fear leads us down is fear leads us down a path toward guilt. Because that's exactly what Satan wants us to do. Satan wants us to focus on the Goliaths. And as the Israelites are standing there and they're facing off against Goliath for those first 40 days coming out there, every day looking, and all the Israelites could see was the size of this building called Goliath. And as they're sitting there looking at this Goliath, and as they're all shaking with fear, Satan's up and down in hell just giggling. I've got him. I've got him. I've got him. I've got him. Because that's what Satan wants us to do. Satan wants us to focus on fearing God, not fearing in the sense of reverence, but fear in the sense of being afraid. Focusing on how do we make God happy? Focusing on how do we please God? Focusing on the struggle that I'm not worthy enough. Focusing on how I see myself as opposed to how God sees myself. What Satan wants us to do is to begin focusing on the Goliath in our life. In the Goliath that's our life. Because when we start focusing on the Goliath, we're not focusing on God. And when we stop focusing on God, then Satan begins to win. Focusing on the Goliath leads to fear. When it leads to that fear, Satan begins to win. So back to our story. So David comes out to the army, as I said. David comes out, and David sees the army. And he takes the food to his brothers, and there's an exchange between his brothers and the men in there, and then there's an exchange between Saul. But compressing a longer story, what happens is David sits there and sees Goliath standing up there taunting the Israelites, and David doesn't see Goliath. David sees God. And David stands up there and says, this isn't right. This isn't right. God's going to deal with this guy. So David goes out, and David goes out there, and he takes his staff and his sling out there, and I like to describe it this way, as David's this little bitty short red-headed guy. He says he's ready. Look it up. Right? But you got this little bitty short guy coming out here, and he's facing this Goliath out here. And as he walks out, he faces this Goliath. Goliath has a nickname for him. Goliath's nickname for him is Sticks. You know, like the little sticks that you pick up? It's Sticks. He has a nickname for him. He calls him Sticks. But David has something in mind. See, David's got his act together. And we can pick up on. David's got his act. I can't remember where I first read it, whether it was John Maxwell or which writer I read it from. It goes like this. The main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. You heard that? The main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. And that's what David has done. David has kept the main thing the main thing. And that main thing is focusing on God. Because if we sit here and we face the world and we see the Goliaths, we're focusing on the wrong thing. When we focus on God, we can start seeing what God's going to do. We can start focusing on what God's power is. We start seeing not only, the question becomes rephrased, not or what we are going to do, but what is God going to do? How God's going to act? What's great thing God's going to do that we need to jump on board? Or at least hang on for dear life as God goes on and enjoy the ride. We start seeing what God can do. You've heard Pastor Short say this phrase. I'm going to apply it to this one as well, where he sits there and he says, God's work done God's way never lacks God's supply. This is a David and Goliath, applies to David and Goliath too. God's work done God's way never lacks God's supply. Why? Because we're focusing on God. We're not focusing on the giant. We're not focusing on the problem. We're not focusing on the war. We're focusing on what God can do. And so as we go through our lives, too often what we're doing is, backtracking a little bit, too often what we're doing, we focus on Goliath. Well, we need to instead focus on what God can do and what God's all about and how God can save us. In there. Got the blank slide for me, Evan? You catch that that background on that slide? Wayne did a great job pulling that background, right? Because you catch the import, hopefully, what we're doing here. But not only the war that we face, the Goliath that we face in life. The most serious Goliath that we face in life is not the stuff we talked about earlier in here. The most serious Goliath that we face in our lives is sin and Satan and sin and death. And it's precisely, listen to what it says in Ephesians chapter 6. And Paul writes, for we are not fighting against flesh and blood enemies, but against evil rulers, authorities of the unseen world, against mighty powers in this dark world, against evil spirits in the heavenly places. That's the war that we're fighting. That's the Goliath in our lives. That's the main thing. That's the main thing. And the main thing that we're fighting against. But the main thing is also, thanks be to God, He gives us the victory in Jesus Christ. The gospel lesson, the gospel and the Old Testament lesson we read this morning fit right into it. The victory we have is Jesus is raised from the dead. God gives us life. That ultimate Goliath that we face called death, this ultimate Goliath that we face called sin, the ultimate Goliath we face called the devil is defeated. That God has defeated him. The Son of David, called Jesus Christ, who's crucified and risen, has given us the victory. And that's what we keep our eyes focused on. And somewhere that's what David grasped. Might not have been able to say it like you can, or maybe like I could. But David grasped it was God who gives us the victory. And that's what makes David and makes us people after God's own heart. Amen.